the government does not only just take a child away if there's a crime. The government takes the child away if there is a dirty house, if there is an accusation that someone might be mentally ill, and yet there's no diagnosis, but we think, well, maybe there is a problem, so we'll use that as our excuse for taking this child away. So basically, it's no longer a matter of police investigating crimes against children. You have CPS, quote unquote, managing these kinds of things. And the problem with that is that, number one, they just lowered the standard of parental and child rights. They gave the government grounds to go in and basically pick and choose whatever kid they wanted, and have certain individuals make up whatever they wanted to get that child away from the family. They also put children who really were in serious danger and who do have crimes being committed against them at a disadvantage, because while all of this attention is being focused on the kids whose parents might have a problem but we don't know, and there is no crime but we're just not sure about things, we don't like how they have a different parenting style, we don't like how they homeschool, that kind of thing. While all of this attention and money is being directed towards children and families where there's no issue, you have that attention being taken away from the kids who have crimes being committed against them. And then instead of having police investigate, who have detectives and people who can investigate actual criminal activities, instead, and who know and have been trained in police school and then through detective work, have had extensive training on how to conduct an investigation appropriately, and what kinds of reasonable cause they have to have, and what kinds of evidence they have to have for that kind of a crime. All of a sudden you've got the lunch ladies who think that they can throw together some kind of a weird report, and they've gone to like social work school their entire lives, and then these social work lunch ladies think that they're going to do an investigation of crime, and then you find children dead. Why? Because the kids who really are in danger, who have crimes being committed against them, have lunch ladies doing the detective work instead of the police. And, so CPS will say, no, we refer things like that to police, but they don't. They're the group that supposedly has the first heads up on anything like that. They're the ones who go out and investigate. And it's basically totally mixed up. It's a system and department that has killed a lot of kids because of the mismanagement and the structure. And then what I haven't gotten into yet is the underlying motive for why this organization. I did talk a little bit about how it allows the government to have a better access to other kids. But, and on that note, what I wanted to say is that when you have MK Ultra, which is when this children's organization, CPS came about, then you have government groups that do want their hands on certain kids. They can then go in, they know that there's no crime being committed against these children, but they go in for other reasons, try to take the kids away from the families, and then they use them for research. They put them with foster families that they already are part of the program, and they basically, then you hear all these stories, don't you hear all these stories about how kids are tortured or abused in foster homes? I mean, some of the foster homes are possibly, a few of them are just not good foster homes. But there are many foster homes that are working with government individuals, and the government knows that to take a child away and to traumatize a child at a certain age is going to create the kind of dissociation and the trauma that they want for their MK Ultra style programs. And as long as whenever the United States government is named as the guardian instead of the biological parent, the United States believes that that child is their property. And when the United States government is the guardian, basically that child is viewed as property of the U.S. government in the same way that a military soldier who enlists with the Army is viewed as U.S. government property. And it's a fact if you look at it. If you look it up, if you sign up for U.S. military, you relinquish a lot of your rights. Basically, you agree, and there is wording about how you are now considered to be United States property. It is the exact same thing with children who become quote-unquote wards of the state, or and state is sort of more like state as in the country, not just one state like Washington State, Oregon State. They become quote-unquote wards of the state, or when they're when the U.S. is and their guardian, they become U.S. property. So when this happens, I mean, I've seen over and over, at that point, you've got people working together, covering up for different things and top research programs. And then you've got frantic parents wondering why their kids are being abused and tortured. They were never abused and tortured before they were taken, and why now they are. And then CPS seems to be doing nothing about it. Why? It's because CPS works with the United States military and other individuals that engage children in programs. It's human trafficking, and other people have made the exact same allegation that CPS is engaged in human trafficking, but the human trafficking that's occurring is for the United States government. They allow kids to be raped and sexually assaulted for the U.S. government, for their little programs. They allow kids to be tortured and picked apart, little piece of skin by little piece of skin. They traumatize children, put them in isolated surroundings, have them starving almost, sensory deprivation, humiliation, and sometimes they might move a kid from one family to another. Other times they stay with one horribly abusive family the entire time. And if the government finds a family that they think is going to work with them, then they could just sever the rights of the biological parents and put that child with a family that is going to do what the government wants. And yes, there are going to be a few families where the government isn't interested in those families and their kids at all. There are a few where it's just sort of a CPS matter. There are situations of actual crimes against children, that kind of thing, where the U.S. is not taking an interest in the child as a piece of property and an object of research. However, that is only to cover the actual, the very real cases where children are abused are used as a cover to conceal the other cases where the United States is just trying to get their hands on your child. The other thing that is wrong with this agency is that I mean, aside from their money laundering and little incentives that they get for taking children away and adopting them out, and the raises that they get and little bonus pay, aside from that, the other problem with CPS is that I just lost my train of thought, which is terrible. I had another point to make. Oh, the other problem with CPS is that all of this research is being leveraged against kids that are lower income, from lower income families. So I've never heard, I asked CPS one time, because, I mean, if we're really looking at child abuse and violence against children, anybody who's taken sociology or psychology or any of these courses or read any of the statistics knows that abuse has been found to equally cover all of the social strata, whether it is kids that are from poor families to middle class families to very high income to the top 1%. It's found that having a lot of money doesn't protect children from abuse and violence. And therefore, conversely, no one can make the assumption that having less money is a risk factor, which is what CPS, what their modus operandi is, and their little thing that they like to run and play through other people's minds is that, well, if they're poor, it's a risk factor. That's a prejudice. That's a factor for prejudicial treatment and discrimination. It has nothing to do with increasing the risk of violence against children. Either somebody's going to, like a natural family is going to abuse the child, or they won't. It has nothing to do with money. So if it is true that abuse, it covers all of the social strata, which it does, then you cannot also claim the contradictory idea that being poor is a risk factor and hold that against poor families. And yet what they do is, because the United States government knows that it's easier to take children away from poor families who have no money for fighting what's happening to their families, and who cannot fight with a legal law firm, or with money and other legal means. It's just easier. They pick out those kids from the poor families because they're easy bait. They're not going to take kids from a middle class to rich family because it's going to be much more of a fight. There will be money and lawyers involved. And why waste all that time and energy trying to get a kid from a rich or middle class family for a research program when all it takes is, when it takes, 100,000 less, or even a couple thousand less, depending on how much they want the child, to take away a child from a poor family that is not going to present a challenge, and because they can't present a challenge financially, they don't have the means. So really, the only risk factor to being poor is that you're at the mercy of the government. There is no risk factor for children living in a family that has less resources. And I have asked CPS before, could you give me, do you have any statistics as to what kinds of income levels the children, the families that you're taking these children come from? And they said no. Didn't like that question at all. And I'm sure, I've never seen, who has investigated that? I mean, I'd like to see an investigative reporter, and maybe somebody who's connected to the media has a little more resources and funding than I do. I'd like to see somebody start asking for FOIA from CPS and ask them to provide the documentation that shows what kinds of families are being targeted by CPS. So when they're targeting poor families because they're easy bait, to come up with a false excuse of saying, well, poverty is a risk factor, is just to cover. And it's also not a reason to take a child from any family. The only situation in other countries, for example in Europe, Nobody touches a child unless there is a crime.